I'll mention while we're taking pictures, Ron's gifts are available on Searchworks at Stanford, but they are all, so all of his image, all of his collection, Jane and Ron's collection is at Searchworks, but you can also get to it on Pixium, and thanks to David and Stanford, all these images are available in high res. And I mean, for those of you who know the map world, like this is not a thing that's practiced everywhere around the world. Maps are sometimes held closely for, frankly, no good reason. They're well off copyright, but many libraries don't share the way that Stanford and the David Rumsey Center do share. So you can see part of Ron's collection streaming over there on that wall, and then you can also on the table over there see his items. They are items, God darn, I'm sorry, Ron. All right, let's keep going. There's a couple of presentations today that will be run through Pixium, and I'm going to tell you more about what Pixium is later, but if you want to see those exhibits, you can snap this QR code, or you can just Google pixium.org. All right, let's keep going. So I just want to say, like, I'm just delighted to have everybody here. This is kind of a love affair, not just with maps, and this is what I've learned from my 10 years in Map Society. It's about art and science and history, and that we all love this and invest in this. And so it's just a pleasure to be sharing all of this with all of you. Okay, we have to thank our advertisers. Let's go to the next slide. So Old World Auction, The Rogues Plot, Mr. Gibbs, thank you. Michael Jennings, Neatline Maps, PBA Galleries, New World Maps, Curtis Wright Maps, Real World Globes. The Washington Map Society is a sister organization to us. We share with them. Barry Ruderman, Original Antique Maps, Pixium, and David Spillman Fine Books. Thank you all for your support. We really appreciate it. Thanks to the David Rumsey Map Center, Evan, Christina, Laura, Niles, and of course, Mr. Rumsey, who's sitting over here. You want to wave your hand. I know you don't like to be recognized, but there he is right over there. We're delighted that David is here today and presenting. Okay. The California Map Society has a board of directors. Many of them are here today. If you go to the next slide, now you can identify them. Ron, Courtney, Juliet, Len, Ken Habib, Matt Pritchard, John Jablonski, Fred. Our two Freds are next to each other. There's Fred 1, Fred Desjardins, and Fred 2. Where's Fred 2? I didn't get his picture up. Fred Auda, John Fleming, Emily Yang, my wife, and me. Okay. We have a magazine called Calafia. It's published twice a year. It's a benefit of membership. It is tremendous. Juliet Rothman and Fred Desjardins have been leading this effort for 10 years, and it's just a wonderful part of the California Map Society. And it's a benefit of membership, and here's my membership pitch. Please join. How much is it now per year for a regular membership? $55? Bargain. What a deal. Please join. I think it's 40 if you are retired. Thank you again, Jane and Ron, for your gift. Let's keep going. Lots of QR codes. I went overboard on the QR code. Sorry about that. All right, let's keep going. And if you go to Pixium, the homepage should look kind of like this, and all the exhibits that say gift 1, 2, 3, or 4 are the ways that you can see them on Pixium. And with that, he is smart, funny, kind, inspiring, determined, gracious, and wise. Ron Gibbs was born in Philadelphia, received his MD from the University of Pennsylvania. He was chair of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Colorado for over 20 years, and is now a clinical professor at Stanford. Ron and his wife have been collectors for 35 years. He has lectured about cartography across the country, and his most recent publication is The Rogues Plot. And before that, he published, I think it's down there too, The Long Shot. And with that, I give you Ron Gibbs.
Good. Good morning. Thank you all for coming here. live or through Zoom. The alternative title for my presentation is The 8 Years of the American Revolution in 25 Minutes. So nowadays, Tom, as soon as we're ready, next slide. Nowadays, many people in the United States get their news from cable news network with such venerable reporters as Wolf Blitzer. If CNN were around 250 years ago, next, it might be called Colonial News Network with an earlier version of Wolf Blitzer. And if you're wondering why I chose Wolf Blitzer, well, I was just so impressed by how distinguished he looked. Next slide. So let's now turn the clock back 250 years and go to the 18th century Situation Room. And here we go for ye breaking news. 13 British colonies in North America declared independence from England, but the colonists, variously called rebels or patriots, have little chance, Wolf Blitzer's sources say. The American Revolution, we're not quite ready yet. The American Revolution was both a political and a military struggle, and forward-thinking colonists in North America were raising new ideas. They argued for the right of representative democracy. They argued for fair basis for taxation. They argued against the divine right of kings and against the extensive powers of Parliament. But for these political ideas to gain hold, there first had to be a military victory. And on the military scene, Britain had the upper hand. They had a professional army, the world's best navy, veteran generals, and deep resources. On the other hand, the colonists had no professional soldiers, experience only as a militia, an inexperienced commander-in-chief, few other experienced officers, and no central resources. Next slide. I promised you 10 maps, and the first one of these is of the British dominions. This is the Laurie and Whittle map, published in 1794, 10 years after the American Revolution, but I use it because of its handsomeness and its accuracy. So let's set the stage for the American Revolution. The American Revolutionary War was fought from Canada down to Georgia, a distance of 1,300 miles. North America in the late 18th century was mostly wilderness with few roads and only 4 cities over a population of 10,000. And North America was very different from Europe at the time. It had hot, muggy summers, which was the military campaign season, and new diseases to deal with, such as malaria. Transportation was by foot and by horsepower. Armies would only move 10 or 15 miles a day, and the distance from New York to London was 3,600 miles, and that would take 4 to 6 weeks. Most of the war was fought along the Atlantic coast or within a few miles of the coast, and geography dictated the tactics. Next slide. We now go to Boston and environs from Marshall's Atlas. This is Chief Justice John Marshall, himself becoming a historian, and he wrote The Life of Washington. This is the atlas published 1832. I use these maps because of their scope and their accuracy. We turn on the dots, Tom. So dot number 1 is Boston in the late 18th century, situated on a peninsula. It was the hotbed of political thinking early in the war. After 10 years of political struggle, the American Revolutionary War broke out at Lexington and Concord. If we go up to dot number 2, Tom, Lexington and Concord is just to the west of dot number 2. The British retreated from Lexington and Concord, being pursued by the colonists, and went to Boston proper, and a growing army of American militia surrounded them. Let's go to dot number 3. 2 months later, at the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Americans were dislodged by the British from their fortifications, but at huge cost to the British in men and officers, and this taught the British a lesson for the rest of the war. Stalemate then ensued over the next few months, and if we go to dot number 4, George Washington, now commander-in-chief, took advantage of a British oversight, and he fortified these heights called Dorchester Heights. And from there, if you just scan out a bit, Tom, you can see how American artillery would threaten the British in the town of Boston. The British had to evacuate, and they sailed off on March 17th, 1776, for far-off Nova Scotia. Next slide. We're going to take a quick look at the Northern Campaign of 1775, first half of 1776, again from Marshall's Atlas. So this map, let's scan out just a bit. This map is of eastern New York on the left side, New Hampshire on the right, and Canada on the top. In September 1775, a small band of American soldiers began a heroic expedition to Canada, hoping to make Canada the 14th state. They started at dot number 1, which is today on the Maine coast, and then they proceeded north and trekked 300 miles through dot number 2 to dot number 3, coming out before the citadel of Quebec City. In a blinding snowstorm, the Americans attacked the citadel of Quebec, but were repulsed at great cost. Their leader was severely wounded. 2 years later, that leader would again achieve heroism, but then he became the most infamous traitor in American history. His name, Benedict Arnold. The Americans then had to retreat up the St. Lawrence and back down the Hudson River Valley, their campaign to capture Canada, a total failure. Next slide. We now turn to the campaign of 1776 and William Faden's map from London in 1776. William Faden himself, the cartographer to the king and a producer of many great maps. Next slide. So this map spans in the center bottom from lower New York Bay and going all the way north up the Hudson to north of Manhattan. After retreating and refitting in Nova Scotia, the British commander, General Howe, had to resume the war to quash the American rebellion. His target would be New York City, the centerpiece of America. At dot number 1, his huge army of over 30,000 landed in western Long Island at a place today still called Gravesend. At dot number 2, a few days later, he handily defeated George Washington's forces at the Battle of Brooklyn and came within a few hours of wrapping up the entire American Revolution, but he delayed. And that delay allowed the American army to escape to dot number 3, Manhattan. 2 weeks later, The British did invade Manhattan and again had an opportunity to trap about half the American army in lower Manhattan, but Howe again delayed and allowed the American forces to consolidate. If we go up to dot number 4, in late October, Washington abandoned Manhattan and made a stand above dot number 4 in White Plains, New York. This was a draw, but the Americans had to relinquish the battlefield. Meanwhile, at dot number 5, in Upper Manhattan, George Washington made a fateful decision, and he left an unsupported post named in his honor, Fort Washington in Upper Manhattan. British General Howe returned from White Plains and inflicted on the Americans their greatest defeat of the war in the North in mid-November. The fort that was thought to hold out for months surrendered after a battle of just 4 hours, and 5,000 Americans surrendered, along with tons of irreplaceable materiel. Washington was pursued westward across New Jersey and made it across the Delaware River to Pennsylvania and temporary safety. Washington was in a glum mood. He said, "I fear the game is pretty well up." Next slide. We now turn to very important actions in the last days of December 1776 and the first few days of January 1777, the William Faden map. Next slide. You see coursing down the middle the Delaware River. To the left is Pennsylvania, and to the right is New Jersey. Let's go to dot number 1. With his options very narrow, George Washington decided to put it all on the line. His forces were now down to 2,500 souls, and what did he decide to do? He was going to attack. At dot number 1, he famously crossed the Delaware. He crossed from Pennsylvania into New Jersey to attack an isolated post at dot number 2. Dot number 2 was Trenton, New Jersey, and here were 1,400 Hessians. These were German mercenaries hired by the British. This became a lopsided victory for Washington. Nearly all of the Hessians were either killed or captured. At dot number 3, 10 days later, in the college town of Princeton, New Jersey, George Washington followed up with another victory, and these 2 small but important victories saved the cause of the American Revolution. Washington's exhausted troops then moved north to a winter encampment in the New Jersey hills. Next slide. We now move to the south and look at Charleston, the largest city in the American South, a population of about 10,000. Next slide, Tom. So this is dot number 1 shows the city of Charleston, the target of the British. And while the war was raging up north, the British sent a seaborne expedition to capture Charleston, but the Carolina militia was ready. And they built 2 forts at dot number 2, Fort Moultrie, and dot number 3, Fort Johnston, guarding the harbor. These were forts made quickly of sand and soft logs. Under American cannon fire, the British fleet, dot number 4, sailed into the harbor. But many of the British warships ran aground and became easy target for the American artillery. The vaunted British Royal Navy had to retreat back to New York its tail between its legs. And this victory saved the American South for the Americans for another 4 years until the British returned. Next. Now we turn to Philadelphia and the map of William Faden, and this copy by Matthew Lotter in 1777. If we look at dot number 1, this is the Delaware River on which Philadelphia is situated. Dot number 2, Tom, shows Philadelphia, well planned by William Penn in the 1680s, a grid which still exists today. Let's look down at the bottom for dot number 3. This was the an elevation of the Pennsylvania State House. Here in July 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed, and henceforth this became known as Independence Hall. And I cannot pass off this map without pointing out dot number 4. This was my boyhood home. Let's go now to the next map. So this is a map, again, showing the coast of the Delaware River and the campaign of the British to capture Philadelphia. For still unexplained reasons, the British took a cautious seaborne route from the end of July until the end of August out to sea along the New Jersey coast, down the Delmarva Peninsula, and back up to Chesapeake Bay. At dot number 1, in late August, they landed at the head of Chesapeake Bay at a place still called Head of Elk, Maryland. When they landed there, they were 65 miles from Philadelphia at dot number 2. They were only 35 miles closer than they were a month before when they left New York. At dot number 3, George Washington formed his army in a defensive position at Chadds Ford along the Delaware River to try to stop the British capture of his capital. On September 11, 1777, there was a battle. It was a total victory for the British. The Americans were outmaneuvered, and only a heroic rearguard action prevented total disaster. Let's go to dot number 2. 2 weeks later, the British marched into the American capital of Philadelphia without firing a shot. Let's go to dot number 4. I think we can see that right up at the top, Tom. But George Washington was not done. And he decided he was going to attack a major British outpost just north of Philadelphia called Germantown at dot number 4. His attack began very well in early October, but because of fog and an overly complex battle plan, things unraveled. The British regrouped and chased Washington's forces away. More maneuvering occurred over the next couple of weeks, and at dot number 5, in mid-December, George Washington brought his forces into a winter encampment on the banks of the Schuylkill River and on the banks of Valley Creek at the hallowed winter of Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. The next spring, following actions that I'm going to describe in a minute, the British consolidated their forces and gave up Philadelphia. Next slide. Now we're going to go to the momentous campaign in the North in 1777, and we'll return to the map from Marshall's Atlas. Again, we see these dots. While the main British army was on its way to Philadelphia under General Howe, Another British army under General John Burgoyne, himself actually a playwright as well, was authorized by the British Secretary of State for the Colonies in London to attack from Canada. The two armies could not support each other, and this situation led to British undoing and the turning point of the American Revolution. In retrospect, the British were hampered by distance, by time, by disorganization, and in fact, ignorance of the conditions in North America. Let's go to dot number 1. Burgoyne's army jumped off from Three Rivers and moved up the Sorrel River to Lake Champlain. He had an army of 7,500, including British, Hessians, and Native Americans. At dot number 2, they made unimpeded progress and in early July captured the American fort of Fort Ticonderoga. They were very uplifted. But at dot number 3, the Americans were gathering a few miles north of Albany to meet the British invaders. Burgoyne was outnumbered and he was stopped in his tracks there. And after 2 battles, one in mid-September and one in early October, he was trapped and he surrendered in mid-October. This was the first major British disaster of the war. This led to the French alliance. The French were age-old enemies of the British, and the French were seeking revenge over their loss of Canada in the 1760s. So again, we have breaking news. With no possibility of escape, British General Burgoyne surrenders an army of 7,000 at Saratoga Springs to the American army under General Gates, and French King Louis XVI takes note and began discussions for the alliance, and this basically ended hostilities in the North. Let us now turn to the campaign again in the South and the late 1779. For strategic reasons, the British now turned south. They wanted to take advantage of the large number of loyalists. So the British Army, after victory and capture of Savannah, Georgia, this time captured Charleston, South Carolina. There was more maneuvering over the next year, with both the British and the American armies maneuvering like cautious boxers. The British would hold the field after many of the battles, but they could not replace their losses, and the American army remained intact. The American commander was George Washington's favorite, Nathaniel Greene, a Rhode Islander himself, and he famously said, "We fight, we get beat, we rise, and we fight again." Next slide. We now turn to late 1781 and Yorktown, Virginia. Next map. So we can see here, dot number 1 is the sleepy portside town of Yorktown, and in September 1781, the British marched into Yorktown to rest and to refit with supplies from the British Royal Navy. But at dot number 2, a surprise happened, and the French fleet came up from the Caribbean, got into the bay before the British, and beat back the British fleet. There was no hope of relief for the British in Yorktown. Meanwhile, George Washington marched his army from New York. He was joined by very strong French allies, and they began a siege of the British at dot number 1. Dot number 3 is the French initial siege lines, and dot number 4, the American siege lines. The siege was very effective, and with no hope of help coming, And with devastating bombardment from the French and the American artillery, the British surrendered in October 1781. The second disaster, the second British army to be captured. The British government and the British people had no more stomach for blood and treasure, and negotiations ensued in Paris. Next slide. This map was originally made in 1756 by an American physician named Dr. Mitchell. This is a French version by the noted cartographer LaRouge. In 1934, it was called the most important map in American history. Let's take a look at it. This handsome map has exquisite detail, so exquisite that it was used at the Treaty of Paris signing to define the borders of the new United States. Next slide. So the breaking news was the peace treaty was signed in Paris, and the reporters say, as we predicted in 1776, England's 13 North American colonies win their independence and the American Revolutionary War ends. So why was it, next slide, that the British lost and the Americans won? What about those criteria that we had at the beginning? Well, the British had the wrong strategy and they had the wrong generals. Britain had burdensome logistics. Every piece of equipment had to come across the Atlantic. The British were hindered by time and distance, and this interfered with their command structure. The Americans fought with the cause, and they had the right leader in George Washington. The Americans eventually had the right strategy, and the Franco-American alliance was critical. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is why we get to celebrate July 4th and American independence, coming up on our 250th anniversary. Now, if you'd like to read a little more, next slide. This is a new novel set during the American Revolution that I just published 3 months ago called The Rogue's Plot. And the next one, published 4 years ago, actually the prequel to that, called The Long Shot. They are historical fictions. I brought along some copies. They're available on Amazon, and I will donate all of the proceeds from the sales to the education fund for the California Map Society, which will go to support the Rumsey Map Center. So at this point, I think I will close and say that I want to thank, last slide, I want to thank those who helped me get this presentation together: Kat Chanover, Craig Moll, Jackie Lasky, and Tom Paper. And at this point, open it for questions. Oh, town crier's bell.
We've got time for a couple questions. Have any? Yeah, Kat. How did Louis XVI find out about? How did he find out that
So the news got to Europe after a matter of weeks. The French would have had informers all through London, and the king and his ministers found out probably by November. And then negotiations ensued. Benjamin Franklin was in Paris. Other Americans had been in Paris as representatives of the new government. Any other? Right. Well, one of the atlases in our collection was called the Military Pocket Atlas, and this has about 6 maps in it. It folded in. It was sometimes called the Saddle Atlas because it could fit into an officer's saddlebags. But these were relatively large scale and might scan the middle colonies at once, or even a larger area. There were maps of cities. There were large-scale maps which were accurate, but maps of the countryside and battlefields itself were just not available. The battlefield maps were published after the battle. The Trenton and Princeton map, that was published in England just about 5 months after the battle. So there was great interest in the English public about what was going on, but in terms of planning, they only had mainly large-scale maps.
Thank you. Thank you. Ron, thank you so much. Our next speaker is Wes Brown, who has been a collector, student, and author of old maps for 30 years. He confines his map collecting to 2 areas, the earliest world maps up to the year 1540, and the exploration and settlement of Colorado from the 16th through 20th centuries. A Denver resident, he co-founded the Rocky Mountain Map Society in 1990 and served as its president for the first 7 years. So he's come into town, and we're very grateful for his visiting us and sharing. He's long been associated with the Denver Public Library. He has published many papers on maps. He is also, can you,
Thank you. It's,
hold on, no, I'm not quite done.
oh, okay.
I wanted to share some incriminating pictures of you, Wes, before I pass it over. He has climbed about 400 different main peaks in Colorado. That's the 14ers. He's been with an investment banker for 30 years, specializing in climbing. There you go, Wes. Thank you.
right.
Thank you so much.
You've got a picture of my wife on the screen, and this was, it relates to an article that was published in the University of Colorado Alumni News about a love map, a map that my wife gave to me when I was 19 years old, and she hawked her typewriter to get the money to buy it. So that's that story. I love maps, and I'm so honored to be here with you, and thank you very much. We're going to jump into this story. I know I have a limited time. So in 1832, London-based map maker John Arrowsmith published 2 maps with overlapping terrain. Mexico, am I to use, okay. Mexico covers Central and North America north to the 42nd parallel. And the 42nd parallel was the northern boundary of Mexico at the time, and of course the northern boundary of California. And British North America was the other spectrum, with the very southern element being Southern California. But here is the overlapping area, and this is what we're going to talk about. This is a little closer to home than Philadelphia, and you're going to learn lots of geography if you don't already know it in this area. Now, I'm going to use Mexico of the 2 maps to tell my story, and the reason was that I purchased the Mexico map by John Arrowsmith in an old world auction, not really knowing. Well, let me ask this. Have all of you, how many collectors are in the room? Have you always understood what it was that you purchased when you bought it? Well, it was the same for me. I didn't really know, but I started investigating this map after buying it, and I couldn't believe what I had found. Now, the great historian Carl Wheat admired the map, but he thought it had been published 10 years later. But I realized it had been published in 1832, and that made all the difference. It was the first to present a whole new view of the Great Basin and California. It was the first in print to remove the mythical rivers that crossed the West. It was the first to name the Great Salt Lake. It was the first to show the Humboldt River in Nevada. It was the first to show an understanding of the Sacramento and the San Joaquin rivers, a better image of those. So you can imagine, as I kept digging into this map, how thrilled I was to think, wow, I can't find anything else that shows this. So now, why was this map so advanced? It utilized the findings of the West's 2 greatest fur trapper explorers, Jedediah Smith and Peter Ogden. Now, John Arrowsmith was the nephew of the famous English mapmaker Aaron Arrowsmith. Aaron, as the foremost British mapmaker of his day, was privy to the British intelligence coming from around the world to the Hydrographic Office of the Admiralty. And especially relevant for our study, he received information from the Hudson Bay Company of North America. Now, John was trained by his uncle, and sometime after his uncle's death in 1823, he went out on his own. Like his uncle, he was privy to all this information coming back to the British government, and he utilized that. He had an illustrious career. He was a founding member of the Royal Geographic Society. He was the hydrographer to the Queen Victoria. He received the gold medal from the Royal Geographic Society. Now, Arrowsmith published his maps as loose sheets in 1832. And so both Mexico and British North America were issued originally as loose sheets, but then he put those and many others together to publish an atlas, which exists here. There are copies here in this collection, the famous London Atlas that you see here, starting in 1834. And this atlas was published with improvements for a half a century more. So now let's look at topography. And I want you to study this map by Aaron Arrowsmith, and you can see a good guess of what was known about the West at about 1800. Not a whole lot. In fact, the spine of the Rockies is highly conjectural as well. That's primarily guesswork. Now, at the time, the Spanish wanted to get from their base in Santa Fe to their missions in Monterey. How would they do that? Well, the presumption was that there would be great rivers coming in from the Pacific into the Rockies. After all, the Mississippi went for 1,000 miles. The Rio Grande went for 1,000 miles. So all that someone needed to do was hike up and over to the west and the north of the Rockies, find this river and float on down to California. And that's what was thought to be the goal. And Friars Silvestre Escalante and Francisco Dominguez led this expedition in 1776, and they followed that dark black line. They started in Santa Fe, they went through southwestern Colorado, they went off to the west into Utah, then they were starting to run out of supplies and winter was desperate. They came down into Arizona, deciding we got to get home, and they safely made it back to Santa Fe without loss of life. An extraordinary expedition. And that resulted in my hero, Mier y Pacheco's creation of a manuscript map in 1877. And we're looking at one of the very rare copies that exists in manuscript form, 1778. I don't have time to go through the details, but trust me, there is incredible information that now the Spanish authorities in Mexico have. Now, do you think that this information, this vital information, was published and shared with the European mapmakers? It was not. These were the Spanish, and they kept all of their cartographic information a secret. Unlike the French and the British, they kept this information a secret. It would be secret for 30 years and more until Alexander von Humboldt, the great baron, in his explorations in the Americas, came to Mexico City in 1803 with a letter from the King of Spain saying, let this man review the archives. And he did so with the result that he published in 1810 this magnificent map, also here in the collection, of the map of New Spain. And we see a little copy up there. Now we're zooming into the territory that we're going to start to focus our attention to. Humboldt is showing his version of the Escalante Dominguez expedition and what he learned from the Miera map. So that would be the little bit known to Europe via Humboldt about the west of the Rockies. What about California? Well, the Mexican authorities by 1830, they knew about the Sierra Nevada, they knew about the coastal ranges, and they knew there was a great swampy area in the middle. But they didn't understand the Sacramento River to the north, beyond just where it enters the bay. They didn't understand the San Joaquin. And even what they knew, which is shown on this map, do you think it was shared with those European map makers? No. So that's the situation that we're going to find ourselves in when we study the maps that were produced. And probably the best example that I can come up with of a brilliant map was that of Henry Tanner, his great map of 1822. And we are going to look at the details of this map. And this is going to present the common view of what the West looked like. In the far right corner, he's got these conjectural lakes that came from the Escalante Dominguez expedition via Humboldt. But let's look at these rivers. He has a lake, River Los Mangos and River Timpanogos, both coming all the way to the Pacific. He has a river Bonaventura starting in what would be Wyoming today, coming all the way to the Pacific, and then River San Felipe starting in Nevada, going to San Luis Obispo. So this was the basic idea, the very best maps that is going to be the setting for our story. So to sum up the maps at this time, there are many vast imaginary rivers that flow to the Pacific coast from Great Lakes somewhere about 700 miles to the east. There's no inland mountain ranges that prevent passage of these rivers, and there's no conception of a Great Basin. Now that story will change. The task of providing the new geographical insights into the area would fall on the hardy soldiers of the mountain men of the fur trapping and trading profession of the 1820s. Two of the most renowned among them would be prime actors in obtaining the information that John Arrowsmith would use and first illustrate in this map. Jedediah Strong Smith, who grew up on the frontiers of Pennsylvania and Ohio, migrated to St. Louis, where he answered General William Ashley's famous call for, and I quote, enterprising young men to enter the fur trade. From 1822 to 1830, Smith distinguished himself as an intelligent and courageous leader. Reading about what he did with the American fur trade is just amazing. He was a brilliant navigator. And by the end of his career, he had seen more of the West than anyone until John Charles Fremont in his expeditions in 1840s and 1850s. So he would be one of the actors that we'll learn about. The other was Peter Skeen Ogden, who traveled the West in 6 expeditions from 1824 to 1830. Now, Ogden was a ruthless officer in Britain's Northwest Company, and he had, and I quote, a mercurial temperament and was forced to resign in 1824. But he was immediately hired by the Hudson Bay Company, arch rival, who put him to work. And his task was to develop the beaver trade along the Snake River. Now, this is a vast area from the Cascades all the way to the Tetons, this vast area. Ogden created a profitable enterprise and became an effective leader. And according to the great historian William Goatsman, he, quote, proved to be the greatest of all the British fur trapper explorers. So now let's dig into this terrain. I'm going to break this down into 3 segments. We're going to deal with the Utah Great Basin, then the Nevada Great Basin, and then we'll look at California. Now, the Escalante Dominguez expedition of 1776 only reached as far north as Utah Lake, shown as Laguna on this map. They learned about the Great Salt Lake, which was 35 miles to the north, from the Indians, who called it Timpanogos, but they didn't actually see it. The expedition also missed the Sevier Lake entirely, using Indian knowledge about this lake which we see as Laguna de Miera. Miera named it for himself. Now let's study what Aerosmith did in this area. We see Utah or Great Salt Lake for the first time on any printed map. We see the Bear River, the Jordan, the Weber River, and the Jordan coming up from Utah Lake, all coming in to the lake, all seen for the first time on a map. You see little Utah Lake, and you can make comparisons with the modern map that I have to the right for you. Then also there's the Sevier Lake and River down below, and then the Virgin River, which connects with the Colorado. Now let's contrast this with the maps as well known up until this point via the information from Humboldt. And here we're looking at the Humboldt map. We have, Humboldt shows Lake Timpanogos with, instead of the Great Salt Lake, the Utah Lake is entirely missing and merged in with Timpanogos. And the Sevier Lake is this huge water body down below and mistakenly fed by the Green. The Green is this mighty river of the west that hooks up with the Colorado, and he's mistakenly hooking it up to fill this vast imaginary lake. So how did Aerosmith get this phenomenal information? Well, the fur trappers first got to the Great Salt Lake in December of 1824 and 1825. A year later, Jedediah Smith and led an exploring party south from the Great Salt Lake along the Jordan River to the Utah Lake, and then further south to Sevier Lake, further down to the Sevier Lake. He named he named it Ashley Lake, based upon his employer, William Ashley. He came on down to the Virgin River, which he named the Adams River in honor of the then President John Quincy Adams. And he showed and learned that the Virgin River connects with the Colorado. He continued south and west to get to Southern California, and we'll learn more about that a little bit further. So now let us focus our attention on the west side of the Great Salt Lake. There'd been this strong belief that if a great western interior lake existed, then surely a significant river must flow all the way to the Pacific. And we see the great westward river coming out of the Great Salt Lake as we know it today on this map on Humboldt. And of course, we saw those great western rivers before. But that is removed on this map of Aerosmith. How did he know that? Well, let's see. Jedediah Smith is field commander in the Bear River country in the spring of 1826, sent a group of men to explore the western side because, of course, they wanted to find this great river. After 24 days of exploration, they concluded, nothing there, no outlet. Peter Ogden also reached the same tentative conclusion in 1829 when he wrote, and I quote, "The lake appears surrounded by mountains and the lake has no discharge." So Aerosmith is reflecting this information. So to sum up why I'm so excited about what Aerosmith is doing in this map in the western part, in the eastern part of the Great Basin, no other printed map before this date had named the Great Salt Lake. He downsized Sevier Lake and Sevier River, eliminating Miera's mythical lake. He removed the westward flowing rivers. He made all kinds of great improvements. Now let's go to the area that would be Nevada today. He's going to radically change this image as well. A study of his map is going to show this great river, the River Buenaventura, flowing westward into the vast open expanse. But it doesn't connect to the Great Salt Lake. It's a new river that forms further to the west. And he shows the river emptying into a large water called large swamp, lakes, and islands. So what can we make of these new geographical features? Well, in his fifth expedition, Ogden discovered the life-saving, west-flowing Humboldt that he named the Unknown River. He followed it to the famous Sink, where it spreads out for many miles as a shallow body of water. And upon receiving reports of this, of course, Arrowsmith did his best to give us this view. Now, Arrowsmith is then showing this new west-flowing river, giving it the name Buenaventura that was on the earlier maps and was utilized by early folks at that time. 13 years later, explorer John Charles Fremont would rename this great river. He'd name it the Humboldt River. After who? Who? Alexander von Humboldt, right? So we know it as the Great Humboldt River, and you can see an accurate view of it over on the side there. Now, the Great Lake, let me go back, sorry. The Great Lake that it flows into, as shown by Arrowsmith, is today called the Humboldt and the Carson Sinks, two related sinks today. So now let's move to California. And I was shocked to find something new and interesting on this map relating to California as well. Perhaps the best printed map of the area before Arrowsmith was by Adrian Bruet that shows the Sacramento and the San Joaquin incorrectly flowing from way to the east in what would be Nevada today. Now note how Arrowsmith corrects both rivers, with the Sacramento that he named the River Buenaventura North Branch flowing from the north, and the San Joaquin growing, building west of the Sierras. This is a great new image. Smith, now how did he get this information? Well, Smith, who followed the Sacramento northward in 1828, referred to it as the Buenaventura, so naturally Arrowsmith would do the same. Peter Ogden and Jedediah Smith both made treks along the San Joaquin. In fact, Ogden held the foothills because he was trying to avoid the Spaniards. Either Ogden or Smith's information passed to Arrowsmith, who displays it here for what I think is the first time that we have this kind of improved image of both these great important rivers. Now, another thing of interest to you Californians would be in Southern California. The Martyrs River flows eastward into a lake, Now, this river, really the Mojave, derives its name from early name from Father Francisco Garces, whose 1776 expedition from Tucson to Los Angeles resulted in his discovery of this east-flowing river. Now, the river first shown on Humboldt's map is first shown on Humboldt's map of New Spain, and you see it over there. But Humboldt incorrectly showed the river as flowing westward, and of course he doesn't show this important lake. Arrowsmith corrects the river's direction and shows the sink using knowledge from both Jedediah Smith or Peter Ogden. They both passed through that area. Now, how did Arrowsmith get this revolutionary information to put on this map? Well, in the 1830 map clearly illustrates for the first time findings of Peter Skeen Ogden. Well, unlike many early fur trappers, Ogden filed reports and maps and sent them back to the Hudson Bay Company, which went back to England, was reviewed by Arrowsmith, and so it's not surprising that Ogden would come up with the information from Ogden. But how did the map maker obtain Jedediah Smith's information, who was an American competitor against the Hudson Bay Company? In 1828, Smith's second trip from the Great Salt Lake to California and north up to the Columbia River was a disaster, with all but 3 of his men and Smith massacred by the Kalawatsit Indians. Now, the Hudson Bay Company kindly allowed the survivors to recover at Fort Vancouver. During his stay, Smith provided a map and details of his journey, which was transmitted to the Hudson Bay Company and found its way to John Arrowsmith. And as a result, we have Arrowsmith getting this amazing information and so early. Now, what about the concept of the Great Basin? Those of you who have studied Western maps know this marvelous map by John Charles Fremont, 1845, in which he justly deserves the renown for this long sentence right along this, stating that there's this great basin in which the no rivers communicate with the sea. So this is the idea of the Great Basin. What? Seville with savages. There we go. But in a bold judgment, and in contrast to the maps of the day, you got to remember the maps of the day were all showing those rivers going all across the West. In this bold judgment, Arrowsmith throws that out. He has removed the rivers flowing west from the Great Salt Lake. Thus, the rivers flow in to form a basin at the Great Salt Lake. The Sevier, the Humboldt, and the Mojave rivers flow inward to their respective lakes and sinks. It's only with two little dotted lines, I'm sorry about that. It's only with two little dotted lines that Arrowsmith suggests a possible link between the Sacramento and the San Joaquin rivers and to the other side of these Sierras. So I'm going to sum up now this marvelous map that as I kept digging in, I kept being surprised, thinking, this couldn't be the first map to show this. This couldn't be the first map to show that. And I believe it was. So to sum up some of the firsts, it's the first map, to my knowledge, to show any of the findings of these two great, most important explorers, Jedediah Smith and Peter Ogden. It's the first to show the Great Salt Lake based on non-native information and observation. It removes the mythical rivers that flow west out of the lake to the Pacific. It shrinks the giant Lake Miera, mistakenly fed by the Green River, down to the modest little Savior Lake fed by the Sevier River. It connects the Virgin River to the Colorado. It's the first to show the Humboldt River and draining into its sink. It's the first to correct the direction of the Mojave and show it draining into its lake. Finally, the map provides a significantly improved image of the Sacramento and San Joaquin River. So all in all, this is one heck of a map. Now, don't you think that if Aaron Arrowsmith, the great Aaron Arrowsmith, were alive to inspect this map made by his nephew, wouldn't he be proud of his nephew? I think he would be. So anyhow, this is maybe more detail than you wanted on a map, but you never know. When you buy a map in an auction, you never know what you'll find. Sometimes you'll continue to be surprised. Now, for those of you who are in love with this map and want to learn more, about a year and a half ago, I published a detailed article with lots of footnotes and more technical commentary that I had to remove today. Thank you very much.
We've got time for some questions. John?
Repetition of the name Buenaventura, and it's in both places on the John Arrowsmith map, but the earlier Spanish maps, the distance between north and south is so squished. Is there any possibility they were trying to name the same thing?
It's possible. I think the Buenaventura was just this common name and it was used by Smith. So I think he just applied it to that.
Was that Ogden, just a random fact, was that Ogden the brother of the first mayor of Chicago? I was trying to Google it.
Not to my knowledge, but it's the Ogden that we know of, Ogden, Utah. Yeah, definitely. Yes, sir.
Wes, is there any evidence any evidence that these explorers used astronomic observations to locate themselves? I mean, it had been done, you know, 2 or 3 decades before that by Lewis and Clark.
I think
I'm surprised that if they didn't, why the technology didn't translate.
well, I'm not sure about the answer to that, but I can tell you, reading the journals of both, they're really focused on commerce, business, and they're doing dead reckoning, keeping journals with dead reckoning. They're doing some latitudinal calculations. They're not doing, to my knowledge, any longitudinal calculations. One more question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was curious, not to Monday morning quarterback the explorers and the map makers. I'm curious why the salinity of the Great Salt Lake wasn't a pretty strong clue that there couldn't have been a large westward flowing river out of it. Like that seems like it would have been a pretty strong indicator
Yeah,
that it's a terminal lake
yeah.
and most likely does not have a major outlet.
Well, I think part of it is, first of all, it's a great big lake, and they believe that there was an outlet. Every map before showed the outlet. So even though we look at it now and think, of course, how could there be an outlet? And likewise with these other lakes as well, these other inward sinks, they're very alkali as well. Thank you very much.
Do you want to come up? Yeah. I'm delighted to introduce David Rumsey. The arc of his life and his career inspires me so often. You might not know that David was an artist. Why don't you jump down? I'm going to incriminate David here a little bit. Lived on a commune, combined his love of art with his technological capability. Anybody want to guess where David is in that picture? The hood, exactly. Combined his love of art with his technological capability to create a light show and installation in the Boston Common, or that David was a very successful real estate investor. Let's go to the next slide. He can describe these at a later date, but the picture in the lower left is the commune where he lived. In what state was that, David? Connecticut. But you probably know that for almost 2 decades, David has been a prolific map collector and the driving force behind the David Rumsey Map Center, which is one of my favorite spots on the planet. And on behalf of all the collectors and students who have used David's images, I want to offer my sincerest and deepest gratitude. Thank you. I admire, let's go to the next page. I admire many things about David. One is that he has had and appreciated the mentors in his life. Walter Walker Evans, the photographer, and Chuck Feeney from Duty Free Shops and the Atlantic Companies and Philanthropies. Another is that David is a tinkerer and an experimenter, and on what he is now tinkering is the subject, I believe, of his talk.
Thanks, Tom. This is the latest Tinker, which I'll be talking about today. Maps, as we've seen in the talks today, maps uniquely benefit from digital technologies and the revolution in digital technologies. So at the Map Center, we continue to try to push the envelope. Last year, I gave you an update on our OCRing of maps. 100 million GeoJSON files with place names on maps to allow people to get beyond just our metadata descriptions. Since then, we've begun picking up a theme that we started in 2016 when the center opened, which was the use of VR technologies to visualize maps in 3 dimensions. And we used Oculus Rift headsets. We had 4 of them here. And they were quite successful, but they were quite limited in that we couldn't get content into them easily. We had to deal with other content, which was interesting. But we moved from those to the Microsoft HoloLens 1 and 2, which gave us the ability to introduce globes and maps. But it was that technology, which is still there today, is very limited in its interaction. So starting in February, when Apple released this Apple Vision Pro headset, we began a new effort in collaboration with a group at Monash University in Australia, led by Bernie Jenny, and with Dilpreet Singh and Kadak Satrati. We worked with them. Bernie's had a long interest in globes and in VR globes, and so they basically have done the code work. We've provided the textures, which are the globes themselves, 21 globes. And it's essentially what's resulted is an app that's freely available in the App Store for Apple Vision Pro. Apple Vision Pro is still very expensive. It's $3,500. It will come down in price, I'm convinced, over time. But we want to continue this research with this team in Australia. And I'll show you, I hope it all works, some of the globes and what we've done with them in the first phase. It's a free app in the App Store called Globes 1.2. And as Evan said, well, it's a lot of fun, but we have to figure out the pedagogical uses. And I think we will, but they're still to come. So I'm going to put this headset on and hopefully show you. You'll see on the big screen what I am seeing. Yeah, you will in a minute. The way this works is you look at things, and you'll see me then clicking. I'm clicking on mirroring. Now you should be seeing what I'm seeing. Yep, you are. Okay. So now you should be seeing, I don't want to look at the screen because then you'll get the tunnel effect. But are you seeing the list of globes? Yes. Okay. So there's 21 globes, and you can see them as globes or as panoramic views, or a couple of other ways. I'm going to open this globe, Celestial Globe by Pardis. It opens up. I can grab it, move it around. I can expand it. I can turn it. I can make it go looking at the north end. One of the real innovations, one of the difficulties working with globes, and go to the south end, are the poles. They tend to get scrunched and out of focus. And Bernie did amazing work with his team on making these work, very well. So you can also, combine globes. Here's Heinz's 1891 world globe. This was the largest globe ever made at the time. You can turn it. It was about a meter in diameter. They'll push each other. Then you can also, in this case, we'll open Coronelli's globe, move it around. This is an amazing globe. There's so much going on here that you could see. Now this one is one of our largest textures. The latest version now can add the globe in a panoramic view. And you could see inside, as if you're inside the globe. It wraps you 360 degrees. And you can turn it. And then finally, they have something called animation that lets you bring up a globe, like I'm doing here. Oh, wait a minute, sorry. Lost it. So this globe now will change. We're stressing the system. Anyway, it goes from one globe to the other. It changes size. I'm going to just move the menu out of the way. So there you are. I think I should stop here before the whole edifice crashes down. But you get a sense, I mean, this is the kind of space that I don't think you've ever inhabited before. I certainly haven't. And I think it has tremendous possibilities. Michael Keller has generously donated 10 of these headsets to the center. We're waiting for Apple to allow 10 users to all see the same thing. So 10 of you could be with me in this space. I think that's going to have real potential for teaching. So we're very excited about that. Anyway, that's about it. So I'm going to take this one off. Okay. Thank you. Well, and really great thanks to our collaborators at Monash University. Bernie Jenny, it turns out, is an old colleague and friend of Peter Predahl, who did all the georeferencing on our site over the years. And Bernie's been just amazing, as has Dilpreet and Kadek. We're going to move to flat maps that can be on surfaces with terrain. We're also going to work with data visualization, where we can have three-dimensional data visualization that you will actually walk through, if you can imagine. So we're not just limited to flat surfaces. And we're also going to use that wonderful Bellerby globe that you see in the back of the room on its, by the way, it's just arrived new stand that we're very proud of. To be able to use this device to display data on top of the Bellerby globe, and so on. So we'll just keep rolling through different things. Maybe next year we'll have something else to show you. So I think the way we're going to do it is any one of you that wants to see it. Some of you may have seen it at our other event, at the anniversary event. So, but inviting someone to come up. Yeah, someone can come up. I'm going to change the. Hang on a second. I'm going to put on this.
Mike Landis, your son want to do it? Who wants to do it? Come on. I'll do it.
Tom, you're it.
Okay, I'm going for it.
You go for it. So what you do is you put the battery in your pocket on that side. Then, oh, I'm sorry. I wear lenses, so I have to take my lenses out. Okay, and then you'll put it on, and you're going to get some green.
Yeah.
And then click where you're clicking. Yep.
Okay,
To a
check
line.
mark. Okay, there we
Okay.
go. I can see you.
Okay, and now I'm going to click on this, and that'll give you a menu. Do you see there's two apps, globes?
No, I saw something before.
Okay, wait, click it again.
Okay, yes.
All right, you want to look at the one on the left, the one that
Okay.
doesn't have the yellow dot, and do your finger click like that. And
Get
that's,
it?
did that open the menu?
I think so. Can you see what I'm looking at? I've got a bunch of globes I'm looking at.
That's good. Well, we're not seeing what you're looking at.
Okay.
We're seeing you and me in
Okay.
space. Now, just look at any of the little, to the left or under each globe, you'll see there's a a globe and then another symbol and another. Look, click on the, look at the left one. And
Time globe?
yeah, take the behind and click on that. Did that open it up?
I got one, I've got a different one.
Okay, you got one open. Then you can make it bigger by clicking both and pulling. Yeah.
Not sure what I should be doing here. Oh, pushed it away. Come back.
Grab it, that's it. Got it.
Ah, okay, all right. You have to move away.
Yeah, grab it and push.
Okay. Okay,
And then go back to the menu
okay.
and to the right of the globes, so there's the globe itself, and then there's three little clickable items. The mid one, click the mid one, and that'll open up the panorama. Any globe, and then choose the mid, and we'll click. Click your fingers, that's it. Did that open up the wraparound?
Okay, got it. This one, can you see it now?
I can't see what you're seeing.
You guys can't see what I'm seeing? Oh my gosh. Okay, this is kind of amazing.
You're in it.
I'm how do how can
You click
share-
and pull it. Click and pull it, and that'll.
It's amazing. Oh, I'm inside of it.
Yeah,
Holy
you're
moly.
inside of it. Yeah.
Can you see that at all?
Well, we know you're seeing
Well, I
it.
know, but can you see what I'm seeing? I
No.
want to share what I'm seeing.
I
It's
know.
it's kind
We
of
lost
interactive.
the connectivity, right?
All right.
You changed. We did that because
It's
of this.
amazing.
Okay.
It's amazing. I'm sorry. I couldn't be a better student.
Okay. I think Pixium's going to be moving in this direction. Any questions on it, or
Anybody else want to try?
or?
And how, this is
Yeah.
set up, we have some extra ones here.
Yeah, we have
over lunch,
another
right?
one. Although, yeah, we could do one more. I guess one more
Who's
person.
had practice in this?
Or maybe Tom, they probably saw it enough on the screen. But are there any questions? I know we're running a little bit late, so are there any questions on where we're going with it, or what you think we should do with it, or is it all just
I have a question.
eye popping?
Can you hear? Can you hear?
A large satellite globe.
Can you talk into the mic?
Yeah, and an obvious application would be just using something like Google Earth to have like a large, satellite view of the entire globe.
Oh, that's a great question, and we believe Google Earth is going to be putting Google Earth into Apple Vision Pro, which will be awesome. That'll be amazing. That will be a huge resource. You can imagine what you could do with it. So we're waiting on that.
John, I know we have questions from online.
They were from the last talk, sorry.
From the last talk, okay, all right.
What about APIs to integrate with all the remote sensing that's going on, like the geos, satellites and the various things, to be able to get those multidisciplinary and multivariate data arrays associated with the
That's a wonderful idea. We've been so focused on these old globe textures as our sources. But that's yes, I'm sure Apple seems quite committed to the operating system. They've continued to update it now 2 times since February. They're not getting the uptake in sales that they would like, but I will say that anybody who's serious about AR, VR, and that's, Bernie's team at Monash is really one of the best in the world. We found them through a scholarly article that they published that just blew us away. That was last year. And Bernie and his team say that this device is like a factor of 10 better than anything. And particularly for our beloved maps. Did you see how sharp it is?
The resolutions.
The resolution's unbelievable. With the HoloLens 2, everything was no matter how high the resolution you put in it, it couldn't put it out. So I think that's other inputs, absolutely. Yeah.
David, I have a question.
Yeah.
What about integration with all the digital humanities efforts and things like Matterport, where you can be inside of a pyramid or a room and using, linking from one of these globes into other spaces?
Absolutely. Again, that's a matter of sort of an API to bring that data in. But that's what's so great about this device is it's really designed for you to build your own stuff. And that's the difference between, I mean, not to knock Zuckerberg, but everything that Meta does is pre-built, and it's very difficult to build your own worlds in it.
One more question here.
Yeah, yeah.
It's actually more of a comment, but with respect to wanting to do educational things, if you remember Google Cardboard, before there was VR headsets, Google put out this very cheap cell phone-based Google Cardboard device. And one of the great things about it is it linked to the thing called Google Expeditions, which a lot of teachers have already used to use Google Earth to walk around the planet.
Yes.
And there's a whole ton of online lesson plans already existing for this. I recommend this as a source for you to mine.
That's great.
So
I
that's
love
one
it.
thing is,
Yeah.
and they also figured out how to lock all the students with the teacher's head. So as the teacher is walking around through that, all the students would follow along. And
Yes.
they've already figured out the UI mechanisms to allow that to happen and turn it on and off and so on.
Could you send me something?
Yeah, I'll be happy to.
I would love to, just david@davidrumsey.com. That'd be great. That sounds very exciting. Okay, thanks very much.
All right, we're doing great for time. We're going to break for an hour and 5 minutes. So we'll restart at 1:15 sharp. Thank you very much. Exit, if you exit, if you want lunch, and you exit, there's two exits, and through one of the exits, you can see the Coupa Cafe. Okay, can you hear me? All right, we're going to get started. Thank you very much. Andrew Gu studies, our next speaker, studies history and computer science at Williams College and is Pixium's curatorial intern this summer. His interest in map arose from a long-standing love of fantasy, monsters, and medieval understandings of space, time, and prophecy. Andrew loves learning about anything that can tell a story, but his most recent projects include a history of 14th century Mediterranean slave trading and crusading, and, get this is a mouthful, an investigation into the roles traditional stories about outlaw brotherhoods played in the decisions of early 20th century Chinese gangsters.
It's a lot. Talk about that.
That would be less tame, more tame, I'm sorry, than the talk that Andrew is going to give, which is titled Making Race in Early American Maps and Art. And I actually want to seriously say that I admire Andrew not only for his curiosity, but for also his courage in addressing this topic. So with that, I give you Andrew.
Got our energy on today. So, hi everyone. Thank you for coming, and welcome to Making Race in Early American Maps. So, a quick content warning. So this presentation is going to involve some kind of confronting racist images. It'll involve depictions of nudity and references to sexual violence. I don't want to ruin anyone's experience of the presentation today or at the conference today, so feel free to leave at any point. Also a disclaimer, this presentation consists of my views alone and does not represent the views of Pixium, Williams College, Tom Paper, Rich Bryman, or any of the academics who've helped me along the way. Any mistakes are mine and mine alone. So let's get started. So in 1950, the apartheid government of South Africa defined a white person as a person who, in appearance, obviously is, or who is generally accepted as a white person, but does not include a person who, although in appearance obviously a white person, is generally accepted as a colored person. And even though this is a mess, South Africa's definition follows many other definitions of race, mashing up together a bit of physical appearance with a whole lot of social signifiers. And physical appearance alone does not make race. It comes with all manner of this social and moral baggage. And so to get our definition straight, by making race today, what I mean is a project dedicated to making physical appearance communicate a set of values and behaviors that are, allegedly, passed down through reproduction. So there is a problem, of course, with this whole project, which is that it's nonsense. That appearance is deceptive. That's a problem that Europeans first ran into even when the word race, or raza in Castilian Spanish, first entered European vocabularies in the 1400s. So anyone have any guesses as to what raza may have meant in 15th century Spain? I've included a terrible clue for you in the corner. Sorry? Not necessarily. It's a bit weirder than that. Yeah, this is, although that might be, this is related, but it's a bit further away from what you're expecting, I think. Yeah, it's. Can I record this or? I wish I could bring out, if any of you recall the title slide, maybe this will help. Oh, horses. So what, excuse me. So yeah, horses is pretty on point because early modern European understandings of descent actually came in large part from animal husbandry. So when we're talking about raza and race, what these initially refer to are breeds of animals. So for example, here I've got where's my mouse? Here is a 1609 English Horseman's Manual, which the handwriting is terrible here, but that it refers to a race or breed of horses. And so, as with kind of Lamborghinis or Bugattis today, high status European men loved collecting horses with prestigious razza. Horses descended from these exotic stud farms whose origins implied a certain level of kind of performance quality. There is a problem though. So here, we've got a Bugatti and a Lamborghini. Can anyone identify for me which one is which? Yes. Oh yeah? Yes, the Lamborghini is the yellow. How do you tell? Yeah, the brand. That's a word to keep in mind for later. So here's a bit of a harder challenge. So we've got a Spanish horse, a Flemish horse, and a North African one. Which is which? So yeah, this is a bit of an unfair question, but if any of you had any ideas, these labels can help you out. So you can check how you did, but B is for Barbary, which is just part of the North African coast. But we run into a problem where even with this kind of confusing mess of an explanation, what if the North African horse, the Barbary horse, were brown, as many of them are? Or what if the Spanish horse were white and freckled? The problem is that two horses of the same race might look more different from one another than two horses of different races. So what do you do if you want to show off your prize Barbary horse to all your friends? Well, let's go back to the Lamborghinis. This is where branding comes in, where you need to mark your horse if you want your friends to be able to quickly identify its race and to at the fact you own it. Branding tools and horseman's manuals like this one existed to teach people how to see race, just as both race and branding were making the jump over to human beings. And so overall, the point is that animals helped make race. Europeans in part associated human reproduction and appearance with worth by referencing this whole world of prestige animal husbandry. And for American colonial maps, they are opening a window to us into how human beings learn to see race and how they learn to use it to divide humanity. That Europeans and Native Americans encountered these people who looked physically different, and they made those differences meaningful by incorporating them into the stories they told about themselves. In other words, they made sense of these newcomers by referencing their own traditions around the other. European men compared indigenous people to animals, to women, to the non-Christians of the old world, and to lawless forest people. Native Americans try to incorporate Europeans into their existing stories about humanity's place in the universe. But there was nothing inevitable about using race as we think about it today to categorize humanity. So what can maps tell us about early modern race making? Hailing from Rich Bryman's collection, this is a 1634 map of Guinea by the Dutch cartographer Willem Blauw. So based on this map, what do you think Blauw finds important about West Africa? Oh yeah, we have the Slave Coast in Benin. This dates from the start of the West Africa or the Dutch West Indies Company's involvement in the African slave trade. As, you know, what's really jumping out from the page here? Yeah, the animals. Oh, and yeah, the ivory, that there's all these sorts of resources coming out. But I guess the big point for me are the animals. So the Blau Guinea map showcases the process by which Europeans began to animalize indigenous people. In 1630, so 4 years before this map, the Dutch West India Company brought a live chimpanzee to Amsterdam, causing this wave of excitement that apparently swept up this map's dedicatee, Dr. Nicolaas Tulp, if you see his tulip coat of arms in the corner. You might recognize Tulp as the doctor teaching the anatomy lesson in Rembrandt's anatomy lesson. But he would actually go on to write the first published description of a live ape in Europe in 1641. And here is the image which accompanied that description. So the historian Silvio Sebastiani argues that for Tulp and the people who followed him, the chimpanzee narrowed the divide between humans and animals. The names he uses for chimpanzee here, if you can see the Homo sylvestris and orangutan, mean man or person of the forest in Latin or Malay, respectively. In Europe, the few remaining wild forests were the homes of outlaws and these bands of abandoned children. And some of these associations here with that name might have transferred over to indigenous people, whom Europeans were routinely depicting as these nude forest dwellers. Tulp's description here emphasizes the chimpanzee's human appearance. So you can see that in the kind of expressiveness of this animal's face. And also its ability to use teacups, a kind of symbol of well-to-do civilization. And in the tradition of early modern science, he mixed his notes on the chimpanzee with these outlandish Greco-Roman stories to suggest that orangutans had an insatiable lust for women, a trope that European travelers were imposing and would continue to impose on indigenous people across the world. So when we look at the ape perched above these two African figures then, what we might be seeing is one of the first European moves to turn indigenous people into wildlife. In the Americas, American Indians began thinking about one another in terms of these categories familiar to their own groups. So on the left, we have this modern recreation of a 1607 Virginia Algonquian world map as described by the English colonist John Smith. So made as part of a ritual, its 3 concentric circles describe these 3 different boundaries. There's Algonquian territory, the continental coast, and the edge of the world. But ultimately, this map is about relationships, right? The bond between those people making the map, these kinds of borders between the community and the foreigner, John Smith, in their midst. And here, with the sticks representing John Smith's country on the bottom, we can actually see this group of people incorporating these new arrivals into their pre-existing view of the world. On the right is a 1624 European printed image from John Smith's Book of Adventures, which depicts the same event, the same ritual. And so filtered through European eyes, the Algonquian mappers become these kinds of pagan magicians, you know, the conjurer on the top, and also idol worshippers. European Christians are applying the mental frames that they use to describe non-Christian others back home to those in the Americas. And again, in the Americas, we're talking about making race here, which combines appearance, values, behavior, and reproduction. And in this project, no category was a more natural reference point than gender. This is the Library of Congress's 1721 British copy of what was probably a Cherokee deerskin map. And according to Professors Susan Scholten and Ian Chambers, it represents this Cherokee proposal for a direct trade agreement between the South Carolina colony and the Cherokee, bypassing all of their competitors. This is another relational map. These circles denote the different native communities in the area. On the left, we've got Charleston with its street layout, and the lines between are these physical paths or diplomatic links between all of these different groups. Of interest for us today are two figures, whom Ian Chambers identifies as Selu, the Corn Mother, the first woman in Cherokee mythology, and the first man, in Kanate the Hunter, in Cherokee tradition. Based So, based on this map, interacting with Europeans seems to have been kind of a male affair. That we've got Kanati kind of far from home and close to Charleston, and meanwhile Selu stays near the Cherokee Circle. In the Cherokee origin story, Selu actually uses her body to draw a circle around in front of their family's home. And so when we're looking at all these circles denoting these different Native American groups, is that these might also show women's control of the community's boundaries, which as a point was apparently important enough to include on a map that was still made for foreigners. But gender from a European perspective could be a bit blunter. In male European eyes, norms about low status European women cast a shadow on Africa, the Americas, and their inhabitants. So this is another Blau piece from Rich Bryman's collection, and it's a 1640 Atlas frontispiece or title page by Willem's sons Johan and Cornelius, showing allegorical figures of the four continents, Europe, Asia, Africa, and America, in a traditional standard order. So you can consider the hierarchy at play here. We have Europe and Asia on top with all of their clothing and their robes, while down below are Africa and America, who are once again shown with animals and in nude. And America, in particular with her axe, embodies the stereotypes of the savage and the cannibal. But according to Professor Michael Wintle, we can see here these other two long European traditions. The first is using women's bodies as metaphors for conquered or soon to be conquered territory. You can see here, right, Africa and America reveal so much more skin than Europe. And the second is exaggerating indigenous women's sexual promiscuity, something we also saw with Nikolai Stolp's lustful orangutans. But from a male-dominated European perspective, this kind of feminine vulnerability and this accompanying invitation to exploitation came to define the virgin lands of the Americas. So take, for example, the English explorer Sir Walter Raleigh's 1596 account of his first expedition to Guyana, where he's attempting to drum up support for a future expedition by arguing that Guyana is a country that hath yet her maidenhead, not yet torn apart by farmers or soldiers or miners. The language of sexual violence went hand in hand with that of imperial conquest. And the last of our Blau maps, also from Rich Ryman's collection, this 1635 map of the Americas displays both these nude Native American bodies, again, open to exploitation, and what European men were really interested in, treasure. See here Lake Parime, a fictional lake, which Rowley and others swore to be the home of this city of gold, Manoa El Dorada here. And European men are imposing their fantasies on American soil and on Native American people. This French map from 1740 by Jean-Baptiste Nolan II highlights the European framework of what Professor Chet Van Duzer calls, quote, kill the cannibals and convert the rest, unquote. So let's start with convert the rest. This peaceful image on top with these native chiefs listening to these two European missionaries actually follows a theory of Christian just warfare dating back to the Middle Ages. It was, if you were a holy warrior, it was unjust to attack people simply for not being Christians. Instead, if you wanted to launch an attack, you had to wait until your target suppressed Christian preachers, if they were kind of resisting God's word here. And down here, we have the people resisting God's word. If you want to see you can see the severed head in the corner, or in the campfire here. And you can see that guy eating a human leg. So, sorry about all the scrolling. These people are cannibals. And this is actually part of a standard European playbook dating back to a 1503 Spanish law that banned enslaving Native Americans, except for cannibals. So naturally, the Spanish soon found evidence suggesting that all of the native groups who resisted them were cannibals. And so this map is a case of Europeans imagining Native Americans' appearance and behavior so as to check every single box required to turn them into legitimate prey. Of course, this didn't go unnoticed. So while Europeans are constructing this imaginary, uncivilized cannibal to justify their aggression and expansion, native nobles protected themselves by self-presenting as civilized to the European eye. To do so, they emphasized property ownership, respect for law and order, and their bloodlines. So in 1539, 20 years after the fall of the Aztec Empire, this guy, the lead Spanish inquisitor in the Americas, took Omatochzin, a noble from an Aztec royal family, and burned him at the stake for idol worship. So if you remember this Algonquian ceremony, accusations of idolatry had been the standard tool for persecuting non-Christians, particularly Jews, in Europe. In this case, it also became the excuse to confiscate Omatochzin's property. In response, Omatochzin's family drew up this map. Maps like this actually come from the pre-conquest Aztec bureaucracy, and they often appear as evidence in Spanish court cases. So this is an estate map of all of these confiscated lands, and these circles and dots that you can see in these fields are actually measurements. That every dot here is about 50 meters, and every line is about 2.5 meters. So this is an incredible level of precision. It tells Europeans that, we are civilized aristocrats. We take records. We respect private property and law. And so you should trust what we say in court. And in court, the family's argument actually goes, you can confiscate Omatochzin's personal property, but most of the land you took actually belonged to us. So you got to give all that back. So this sentence in Nahuatl above the palace roughly translates to, the palace here belongs to the ruling line, not to Omatochzin. And in fact, native aristocrats actually start leveraging their noble lineages to kind of change their race. And what I mean by that is, so if you remember Ratsa, race as a word makes one of the first jumps from animals to humans when European writers start comparing nobles to these kinds of prized horses of special Ratsa, and they start comparing peasants to the kinds of draft horses you would use to plow the soil. And so we don't know if Omatochzin's family succeeded in this particular case. We do know that native noble families routinely managed to marry their daughters to European nobles. And for native nobles, the argument in these kinds of maps and these kinds of pushes might go that while our bodies might look similar to those of our peasants, in terms of behavior and morality and descent, bloodline, we're actually much closer to you, the nobles. So we'll end with a jump forward in time to the American educator W.C. Woodbridge's 1831 Modern Atlas. The 19th century is this age of science, when you could put climate modeling like this map next to this. This is a moral and political map of the world, mapping these 5 states of civilization you can note the spectrum here from white to black. And in this corner on the top left, it actually just decides to number the 5 races and 5, or not 5 religions, but the 5 races of the world with Caucasians on top. And if we're thinking about the book in which this was made, right, this map is mooching off of its neighbor, the climate map, which had all of the scientific authority. And now it's using that to argue that white people belong on top. But it kind of has to do so through, these kinds of morally charged categories. There's religion, your government, your state of civilization, and it blends each of them into this terrible racial concoction. So, in conclusion, even in 1831, Americans are engaged in making race with all of these factors beyond appearance, because race is not natural. Race is not unchanging or timeless, and it is very messy. However, none of this means that race doesn't matter. Today's maps have shown this wide range of people, for example, Nola, trying to manipulate racial thought for their own ends, weaving together all these associations to make one group seem savage or one land and its people seem ripe for exploitation. Race is made because it is useful. And like a technology, it's developed over these centuries and these millennia to serve the interests of the people making it. And like every generation before us, we today are making race. And we should be very conscious about the meanings and values that we're weaving into it. So I'd like to thank Dr. Rich Bryman for letting me use works from his collection and helping me make sense of them. Professors Susan Schulten and Michelle Apotzos for their help with research and the time they devoted to discussing maps with me. Professor Chet Van Duzer for directing me towards sources on cartouches. Professor Alexander Bevilacqua for introducing me to the study of race. The Williams College ASIP grant program for funding this project. And of course, my supervisor, Professor Tom Paper, for introducing me to the world of maps and for devoting his time, money, patience, and passion to making this project possible. So thank you for listening.
Okay, so you postulate that race is useful. In what way?
I think in terms of the race used here, is that it's really useful to say that these people you want to kick off of their land are inherently, by virtue of their blood, not worthy of being civilized. That's a really great tool you can use to argue that you should have this land instead. Yes. I am not saying that race is a great I hope you don't come away from this with the understanding that race is a great category that we should be throwing everywhere.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I cataloged a map. It was done by a French naturalist, Marie Le Goff, and she created the first ethnographic world map in 1786, together with the royal cartographer of France. And so it's very much an Enlightenment product. It tries classification, and it looks, at different human characteristics, and race is certainly prominent among them. But what's interesting is that, a lot of Enlightenment figures thought that there were different human species, like Linnaeus. And in the case of Marine Le Goff, she actually thought there was only one human species. It was a very ethnocentric map. It showed that French were believers of the true church, Catholics, that they were living in society, that they were humane. So all the things that you talked about were true. But I think what's interesting about it is that, she actually, because she was a Catholic, made that choice out of her religious tradition that all humans are a human species. So religion, I think, this is kind of important, I think, could work both ways. You know, in this case, Enlightenment science was wrong. And, you know, yeah.
Or I think with Linnaeus, he's not making the argument that there are 5 different species. But yeah, there are other people who make that who are more heretically inclined. But yeah, I do agree that Christianity here is very important in the sense of deciding that every human on the planet is a person descended from Adam and Eve. That is crucially important. But as the Enlightenment goes on, and as we start running into orangutans and animals like this, that assumption starts getting challenged.
We're going to hopefully have some time at the end to discuss all of the talks, so I think I'm going to put this moving. Andy, thank you very much. Okay. Oh, once again, for those of you who didn't hear that, I was just telling everyone here how grateful I am for having had 2 students and David and Ron and Wes speak. This has really been great. Dan Scollin is our next speaker. Dan has taught geography, geographic information systems, natural resources, and global education programs at Shasta College in Reading since 1996. Dan has been a member of the Map Society and attended various events for quite some time, and we're really grateful to have him here. His academic background includes degrees in computer science and geography. I don't know if you're going to show any pictures of your travels around the world when you were a tad bit younger. He did at the last event that we had, and it was wonderful. Dan has traveled extensively. His work with students and community includes co-founding the web platform North State GIS and Reading Area GIS User Group. That's Geographic Information Systems. Other affiliations include Shasta Living Streets, Local Indians for Education, Shasta Land Trust, and many more. Dan is married with 2 college-age children, enjoys hiking, cycling, playing, and listening to music, being engaged in the issues of the day, reading about people and places, and he is also the host of a weekly radio jazz show. Dan Scollin, thank you.
Thanks, Tom, for the introduction. Okay, my name is Dan Scollin. I am a geographer, educator, and geographic information systems professional in that order, at least according to my priority list. And I'm going to be talking about historic to digital maps, from instruments of power to tools of empowerment. And I'm starting off here with 2 maps. The map on the left is an 1859 map of the area shown on the right, which is a contemporary hillshade. And it's an area that we're going to be visiting here as we proceed through the presentation, just to the east of Reading. Of course, maps are among humankind's great innovations and are the product of a long history of technological innovation. This is accelerated over the past 50 years with advancements in information, communication, and imaging technologies. GIS, GPS, and remote sensing, the 3 pillars of geospatial technologies, have recently been augmented by LiDAR and drones, miniaturization of devices, and cloud computing, and increasingly artificial intelligence. The result has been that maps have become ubiquitous. They have become critical to the functioning of businesses and government and nonprofit organizations, including being part of a fixture of our daily lives. what is often lost in the mix as we embrace these new technologies is the value that historic maps hold in terms of being a source of information to address a variety of interests and needs. Historically, maps enabled exploration and discovery, land delineation, and resource inventory, but also exploitation, land appropriation, and colonization. In many ways, maps enabled the powerful to subjugate the less powerful. In many ways, these dynamics persist today, contributing to the widening gulf of wealth and opportunity that we see in our communities and in the world. Yet there has been an explosion of easy-to-use mapping technologies and mapping applications, as well as open source data, which has empowered marginalized populations to tell their stories, redress past injustices, and reclaim their futures. So my interest, I think, early on in historic maps derived from this map on the left, the historic map of the Klamath Mountain province from 1964. And I loved this map because I have spent so much time in the region over the years, and it really helped me to visualize where these various mountain spines helped to dictate the path of the rivers that run through this great physiographic province. It inspired me and my own cartographic work, which you can see the product of on the right-hand side. And this is part of my own belief in the fact that I think that one's own personal experience with a place and a region is perhaps the most value that we can bring to it. And I've now lived in the Reading area for the better part of 28 years and had lots of opportunities to explore this fantastic part of our state. I attended a talk by Susan Schulten hosted by the California Map Society a few years back. You see her book down in the lower right-hand corner there. And I was inspired to create this story map in part by way of sort of revealing this emerging interest in historic maps to my students. We had a very cogent and wonderful description of the Cherokee deerskin map, which inspired me in part because I have a long history. Tom sort of alluded to my history, particularly on the island of Borneo, where I lived when I was a boy, and then returned back after my master's thesis and got involved in participatory mapping, working with indigenous Dayaks. This program continues 25 years later, still plays an important role. And I'm currently working on a paper with someone at the East-West Center on Honolulu, where we're looking at how participatory mapping in Indonesia has played out over a number of decades. This is a map that I reviewed a few years ago in Calafia. Thank you to Juliet for her steady hand and helpful input as I went through the writing process on this. And I brought this map up partly because of my personal interest in Native American studies and Native California studies, and also because there were some really interesting cartographic aspects to this map that I wanted to share as well. And there was a number of things that I found of interest on this map. It's showing language groups, sort of dominant colors are language groups, and we have tribal groups, the Achimawi. You can visit Achimawi State Park in northeastern California. But also these references to not only Indian reservations, but also incidents through the history of the period. So for example, you'll see in the upper right-hand corner of this map, you'll see reference to a military outpost to check hostile Indians from 1865 to 1892. which is a rather euphemistic statement of the ways in which whites encountered Native Californians. By the way, I will point out that Fort Crook, you're going to see a Fort Crook crop up here shortly in the presentation. The reality of our historic treatment of Native peoples was the topic of Benjamin Madley's 2016 book published by Yale University Press, in which he exhaustively documents massacres, forced relocations, slave raids, bounty hunting, cultural suppression, and destruction of food resources. You see the quote from the book, "Vigilantes and militias took full advantage of the state of California's anti-Indian legal system to kill thousands of California Indians." And this is actually Captain Jack, the famous Modoc chief of the Modoc Wars, featured in the photo. And again, something that piqued my interest and something that I wanted to explore more. You see the flyer in the right-hand side of the slide here, which illustrates this sort of propaganda war, if you will, that was part of this. So there are a variety of interesting applications that have emerged in recent decades. I'm highlighting two here. On the left-hand side is the Native Lands Digital Project, which emerged out of Canada. And you can see that they highlight territories, languages, and treaties. This is actually a global map with some notable holes in different parts of the world. And when I reached out to the map makers, they encouraged input. By the way, you see the just staggering diversity of Native populations that existed in Northern California at the time. So Cape Mendocino and on north to the Oregon border. And then on the right-hand side is the Digital Atlas of California Native Americans from the Native American Heritage Commission for the state of California. A couple of things that were of interest to me with these maps, in particular, was the representation of boundaries or borders. Native populations of California had very fluid borders, if borders at all, and figuring out where these boundaries were located was handled in different ways. So in the case of the Native Lands Project, they had non-contiguous overlapping polygons. In the case of the state of California map, they don't show polygons at all, but if you click on the map, it'll show a polygon. And actually the polygon I have highlighted, which is shown in blue, indicates an overlap between the Yana and the Wintu, or the northern Wintun, which is an area that we're going to be visiting here shortly. The other thing I want to highlight in the lower right-hand corner is the value of non-spatial data that has geographic references to it. And so they have a list of these various incidents and massacres that occurred through time. And among this list is up to 93 Wintu Indians that were killed 16 miles east of Redding, California. So you'll have these things that weren't necessarily mapped, but actually show up with some degree of spatial reference to them. So I've had the opportunity in recent years to start working with a number of different Native American groups and individuals in Northern California, which has been a great joy and an honor and something that is I hope to continue with in the future. The local Indians for Education, I had a Native student years ago and met him and his wife later on, and she was interested in kind of bringing GIS and GPS into some of their education efforts. So you see the young guy in the lower right. I recently taught just a sort of basics of map and GPS workshop. During the course of the workshop, as I was teaching these younger students, one of the women chimed up in the back and said, "You guys need to learn this stuff if you're going to protect your land And I had to know how to use GPS to find my native plant collection site and my hunting site. So you better learn this stuff, which of course is the best thing a teacher can have, right? When somebody else tells them they need to know this stuff too. And I get out in the field with my students. We're out here with a tribal leader from the Karuk of the Central Klamath River region, talking about cultural fire, of which the Karuk is starting to work with the Forest Service to actually start implementing cultural fire, but also the hope that comes along with the removal of dams, which many of you have been reading and hearing about in the Upper Klamath River region. I mentioned Fort Crook. I happened to stumble on the Fort Crook Museum recently, and I was quite impressed with their collection of native artifacts and native baskets. California Indians were widely believed to be some of the finest basket weavers on earth, and just quite an impressive collection. And as you might have suspected, Fort Crook was part of the effort to stem hostile Indians, as the euphemism went. In the lower right-hand corner, this Wintu individual, longtime member of the community who was part of the workshop that I was teaching, recently asked me to come out to this